We're going to ask everyone who is not on our panel to please turn off your camera and to mute yourselves. We found that when everybody's cameras are off and they're muted, that we have a better technological experience. So if you do that, we really appreciate it. And I'm gonna just get us rolling. So hello and welcome to tonight's panel discussion on immigration and mental health, supporting immigrant children and youth. I'm Kristen Pierce-Freaky, Executive Director of the Austin Child Guidance Center, and I'm gonna be moderating tonight's panel discussion about the mental health challenges facing immigrant children and teens. This discussion is part of our panel discussion series for those who are interested in learning more about uncomfortable and sometimes sensitive topics such as race, racism, healthcare inequities, and their various impacts on children, and how to discuss these concepts with children and adolescents. Austin Child Guidance Center has a long history of providing accessible, high-quality, trauma-informed mental health services to children and their families. We focus on three main areas of programs: care and treatment, which includes individual, family, and group therapy, psychological assessments and consultations, and psychiatric care and medication management. We also offer the only walk-in clinic for children's mental health in Central Texas. Our second program is training and professional development programs, which offers opportunities for staff in the community and community groups. And finally, we have a community education and awareness program, which consists of events and programs such as these panel discussions, our podcast, and other presentations for the community. ACGC employs a team of highly trained, experienced social workers, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and case managers who provide a range of services. We are currently offering services for any child up to the age of 17 years of age living in the state of Texas via teletherapy or in-person services in our newly renovated building. And our goal is always to provide access to the highest quality mental health care in a safe, equitable, and healing space for children and their families. As part of that work, we work to confront systemic barriers to mental health discrimination and economic injustice in our community. So, end of my commercial for ACGC. I want to take a minute for some quick housekeeping. Please keep your microphones and your video off during the presentation if you're not a panelist. This panel presentation will be recorded and posted on our website early next week. The chat box is open for you to ask questions and engage with panelists and participants. Please feel free to post resources or other relevant information in the chat box. We will send all of those resources to you, everyone who's registered for this event next week. And please keep questions related to the topic at hand. I also ask that everybody remember that each of us comes to the discussion with a different perspective, experience, and political view, and various comfort levels on this topic. So we ask that everybody be respectful of others who may be in a different place. We acknowledge that this is a challenging topic and may make some people uncomfortable, but we believe that that can be necessary to make space for real conversations to occur. And finally, we ask you to refrain from using any abusive language towards others participating in this discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Each comes with a deep knowledge, commitment, and passion for children, families, and advocating for ways that our society can better address race and race-based issues. Dr. Laura Amascato is ACGC's lead psychologist and oversees our psychological services. She received her PhD in school psychology from the University of Texas, Austin. She completed her doctoral internship at the Sarah Reed Children's Center in Erie, Pennsylvania, and her postdoctoral work at ACGC. Dr. Amascato's primary experience is in residential treatment facilities, working with children who have multiple complex traumas. She has particular experience working with children who have PTSD, anxiety, depression, and a history of suicidal and self-harm behaviors. In her previous work, Dr. Amascato supervised doctoral interns in individual and family therapy and provided safe crisis management for physically and verbally aggressive teens. Welcome, Dr. Amascato. Dr. Carmen Valdez is a psychologist and chief of the Division of Community Engagement and Health Equity and director of the Community Driven Initiatives Program, both in the Department of Population Health at Dell Medical School. She is also an associate professor in the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin, where she has worked since 2018. Dr. Valdez studies the impact of immigration policy on the day-to-day lives of immigrant Latino families in the United States. She is interested in research community partnerships with the mission to build capacity, self-determination, and improve conditions that lead to optimal mental health. She is a native Spanish speaker from El Salvador and a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Dr. Valdez. Isha Veerasinghe is a senior policy analyst with the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP's, youth team. She focuses on mental and behavioral health impacts on communities living with low incomes, particularly for people of color. She led CLASP's technical assistant work in mental health policy for youth, young adults, and mothers over the past 3 years, co-leading maternal mental health policy technical assistance with 2 states, and leading the efforts of CLASP's Mental Health Advisory Board. She also works on related federal administrative and legislative advocacy. Ms. Veerasinghe previously worked as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Association for Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations. Isha has a bachelor's in arts degree in biology from Bryn Mawr College and a master's in science degree in health policy and demography, from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Isha. Michelle Whalen is an early childhood special education teacher from Round Rock ISD. This is her 25th year teaching in public education as a special education teacher. She taught resource classes her first 2 years, but has been in early childhood special education since then. Michelle received her undergraduate degree at UT Austin in 1995 and her master's degree from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis in 2002. She has worked in Austin ISD, St. Paul Public Schools, and has been with Round Rock ISD for 17 years. Michelle believes deeply in public school education. She received training in trauma-informed instructional strategies prior to COVID and believes that learning those indicators, hallmarks of trauma and the strategies to address the damage has helped her in her daily interactions with her students. Welcome, Michelle. So I'm going to briefly introduce the topic. As of 2018, 4.9 million immigrants or foreign-born individuals make up 17% of Texas' population, with a recorded number of 319,033 children, according to the American Immigrant Council. Immigrants may be refugees, undocumented, or hold a green card. Some may be planning to stay here for a short time or permanently. The topic of immigration can be sensitive and is constantly debated over on the news. However, for today's panel discussion, we wish to highlight the human experience and the psychological impact that lies behind those headlines. The population of immigrant children and youth can be particularly vulnerable to experiences of trauma. Not only does each child have their own experiences and challenges, whether related to displacement, immigration, or adjusting to life in America, but they may also have hidden mental health needs that may be difficult to recognize and address due to the cultural and language barriers and other factors. Tonight, we will discuss the mental health issues that immigrant children and youth may experience, the resources available to help them, and the ways we as a community can support them. Though the majority of immigrants in Texas come from Central and South America, our discussion addresses children as well. Given how politicized this topic can be, we remind the audience that tonight's discussion is not a political debate and ask that you be respectful of others' thoughts and opinions. So let's jump in. And Michelle, I'd like to address the first question to you. What are some of the distressing or traumatic experience that very young immigrant children may have experienced? What kinds of symptoms and behaviors do you see in your classroom?
Sorry about that. I've worked in Minnesota and Texas. Minnesota has a large immigrant population. When I was there, I worked with a lot of families who are from Hmong descent, and they had come from refugee camps. And so that kind of situation is pretty dissimilar to the children that I've worked with in Texas. The children that were living in refugee camps for even really just a small amount of time had a really hard time with trust. They were very fearful of being separated from their families. Their families were very fearful because they had been moved to a place kind of against their will. It wasn't necessarily their choice where to go. So there was a lot of family components when I was working there, but very small children don't really understand time. So like the concept of like, you're gonna stay with this person who you don't know for a little while, your mom is gonna see you soon. None of those things make sense to children, and especially children with disabilities, because they're even more, they have more of a delay. And children, when they have even really small amounts of time of feeling unsafe or scared, it causes, like I said, the fear of really everyday situations. So school settings can be loud. They can be, we move really quickly in school. It's very rigid in a lot of ways. It feels, there's a lot of rules, and that can be really tough for kids.
What kind of impact do you think COVID has had in contributing to these already kind of concerning mental health issues that some of these children have?
I mean, I think that there's obviously a lot of fear in the families of unknown, like losing their jobs, losing their housing, and then the fear of child protection getting into the mix. Because if parents are perceived as being neglectful or abusive, that it's really scary for them to then be put in a position where the government is going to become involved, or a caseworker, or someone that doesn't know them. So that has come up a few times in my class, which has been, they want them to remove the child from school maybe, and not let them come.
Are there strategies or things that you've figured out kind of over the many years doing this work that sometimes helps in these situations?
I think some of it is that elementary school tends to feel a little bit safer for families. It doesn't really seem that large and bureaucratic when you realize you enroll in school, you meet me, you meet the teacher, you learn what the classroom's going to be like, and you realize there's not really, like, I'm the oversight. I'm not really reporting to the government necessarily, except for attendance. And children under the age of 5, attendance is encouraged because the states receive money per pupil, but it's not, they don't really worry so much if, you know, young children get sick a lot. So there's a lot of extended absences in that case. But I think being really communicative with parents, one of the obstacles is translating. I don't speak Spanish. I really only speak English. I have a student right now who's deaf and hard of hearing. Luckily, her mom is hearing, so she and I can communicate. But I think that is also an issue in schools, is because the pay is low, it's hard to find people that are willing to translate. And the words, the technical language can be difficult. So it's not like you can just get anybody on campus to come and translate for you. And then we also have to consider confidentiality. We don't want to really talk. People may not want to talk about sensitive issues with a person who they don't know.
Of course. Carmen, can you address some of these same questions with older children or teens?
Yes, thank you for having me. My work, although I focus a great deal on families, but the youth that I have particularly focused on are what we call the 1.5 generation, which is the children who arrived in the United States at a young age with their parents, and for all intents and purposes, they go to school in the US, they develop an identity as American, and then later in adolescence, they find out for the first time that they are undocumented. And we, you know, some of these are DACA recipients that we know, so the children who arrived early. But I think what is particular about these children is that they often don't know of their undocumented status until they reach the age of 16, 17, or 18, which is the first time that they need a social security number to apply for a driver's license, to open a bank account, to apply for college or a scholarship. And so when I think about the distressing and traumatic experiences of those youth, I think in terms of 3 dimensions. One is the threat and the deprivation they experience associated with being part of a marginalized group. So these are youth who grow up in under-resourced neighborhoods that deprive them from accessing resources. Also policies that preclude their families from being able to have health insurance or from being able to access safety net programs, social services. And so, they also grow up with a great deal of hardship as a result. The second area where they experience trauma or distress is threat related to the possibility of deportation and of immigration enforcement. So these are kids who become very aware of discrimination, of negative social messages that they hear about immigrants. They have near misses with police, with ICE, because in adolescence, you tend to engage in public activities on your own more than you did as a young child, right? As a young child, you're usually with your parents. And so that can add a level of fear for their family if they know that their family members are undocumented. And then finally, the third way is when they actually experience the deportation or the detention of a family member. And so these are youth who experience a total destabilization of their family, of economic security, food insecurity, and they also just the distress of being separated from a loved one. So those are the three ways in which I see these adolescents. And I think for adolescents in particular, this is also a time when they should be becoming more independent, when they depend more on their social relationships, and at the same time, when they have to experience a great deal of caution to protect their families and isolation as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Do any of the other panelists want to add to any of that?
I just want to echo what Michelle and Carmen were saying about the incredible stresses that immigrant children face. And at CLASP, on my team, on the youth team, we focus on young people ages 16 to 25. And we've been keeping an eye on the Household Pulse Survey data, which is US Census data. And I was just looking at the most recent data just in preparation for this panel. And from the last time period surveyed, September 29th to October 11th, for young people ages 18 to 29 years of age. And this is not, unfortunately, disaggregated well, thankfully not by immigration status, but it's not disaggregated any further. But 47.7% have experienced symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder in the past 7 days. 47.7%. I mean, that is incredibly high. And from my perspective, I work in policy and advocacy on the federal level. It's just very concerning how little attention is being paid to that. So I just wanted to add that context there, that there aren't enough solutions being recognized and addressed for young people.
Thank you. On that point, Isha, what are some of the living conditions of immigrant children and youth that may impact their mental health? Specifically, some of the challenges that they encounter in their daily lives. Can you just share some of that with us?
Yeah, sure. And both Michelle and Carmen had mentioned some of these already, but of course, with family separation and restrictive immigration policies, and then you add the effects of COVID-19, all of these factors have led to loss of jobs, loss of housing, security, your own security, family security, safety, loss of routines, and have led to increased isolation. And then you add with immigrant children and young adults, the potential language barriers, and then as Carmen was saying, in terms of stereotypes and biases that young people are also experiencing, plus fear of accessing services because of possible deportation and child protective services, as Michelle had said. And then when you think about policies like the public charge rule, which still has instilled fear in immigrant communities, in some cases, some immigrant populations are scared to walk out of the door because of harmful policies that have been enacted as well. And then you add COVID-19 to that. And then the fact that then they have to also worry about the potential fear of repercussions of accessing public benefits. So public charges, the restrictions of the safety net, a number of public benefits. It will have lasting impacts on somebody's mental health, on stresses, worries, anxieties that could lead to more severe mental health conditions.
Can you speak a little bit more about some of those harmful policies, just in terms of kind of, for those of us that don't know what they are, could you just share a little bit more, specifically what educators should be aware of, some of these harmful policies when they work with immigrant children and young adults?
So yeah, I can talk a bit about the harmful policies, but I also wanted to talk about ones that are more positive. But in terms of the harmful policies include, of course, public charge and all of what we're hearing in the news about family separation and the continuation of the Remain in Mexico policies and restrictions with people being able to, which is a continuation from a long time ago, people being able to access family visas, and the list goes on and on and on. But in terms of positive policies in mental health, with the recent CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, there has been, in our opinion, not enough money put to mental health, but there has been some money put to mental health. And in terms of education, and I'm sure many of you know this already, there have been funds put to the ESSER funds, which are the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. And each state had to propose plans, as to what they were going to do. They proposed them to the Department of Education as to what they were going to do with the plans, with the funds. And Texas had a number of proposals focused on trauma-informed training, and also developing teacher training modules and supports for teachers, and providing LEAs, local education agencies, with guidance on how to support mental and behavioral health and how to implement trauma-informed practices, and also trying to connect counselors with resources, including trauma-informed counseling, and also including some grant programs for LEAs. So and also there are some notable investments in social and emotional learning. So I will just say that if you all haven't seen those funds in those areas that you are working in, to really ask about it, because I think what we're seeing across states is that there's a lot of funds that are going to health departments, but the health departments are getting kind of overwhelmed and aren't entirely sure how best to utilize the funds. So this is what they've said that they're going to do. So just a note that you need to push them to make sure that they're doing it.
Thanks. Before we get to the question in the chat, I wanted to have Laura jump in. Laura, we've talked a lot about trauma. What are some of the signs of trauma that children may exhibit? And are there different signs that you might find in adolescence? What is trauma-informed care, and what does it entail?
I could unmute. When you see trauma in kids, you're going to see very similar things. What you're going to see differences in is the age of the child and the developmental level of the child. But you're going to hear the same sort of things from people. They're going to say they're having a tantrum. The tantrum may look different depending on if the child is a 2-year-old versus, say, a 12-year-old. But it's still going to be a reaction to something that seems disproportionate to the stressor. You're going to, parents will say things like, well, they freaked out. They melted down. What I tend to ask people a lot of times is, what does that look like? Because a lot of times people will just use very general terms like they melted down, they had a tantrum, they lost it. What lost it means, like for one kid, it's going to be very different than what lost it means for another kid, but it's still the same idea in terms of they're what we would consider emotionally dysregulated. They can't manage their emotions in a specific situation. It can also mean that they withdraw, that they just can't, handle being in a situation. It can be crying, it can be yelling, it can be being disobedient. I'm just not going to follow this rule. I'm ignoring you. Being disrespectful. Some of the things that people have already said, where it's a lot of depressive symptoms or a tremendous amount of anxiety. We see a lot of anxiety in kids, particularly right now with COVID and all the things that have been going on lately. There's a lot of anger, a lot of hypersomnia where they're sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. They can have problems with focus and attention. I can't pay attention in school. You're talking to me and I'm not listening. I'm drifting off, or I'm, not paying attention to what's happening. There can be physical aggression, verbal aggression, problems relating to other people. They can't form an attachment to other people, or they form just sort of superficial attachments to other people. They can regress in terms of skills that they'd already learned. So the kids who have already been toilet trained may stop being toilet trained, or older kids may suddenly start talking in baby talk. Their grades may start to suffer. They'll have trouble with problem solving. They'll have nightmares. And in older kids, what you may see are things with, they'll start using drugs or alcohol. They'll behave in risky ways. They'll engage in sexual activity. One of the things that comes up for me too, though, is in thinking about kids who have come from, say, a refugee population or an immigrant population, is sometimes we tend to pathologize behavior that isn't pathological. So it's a cultural difference. You'll have a kid who comes in who is from another country and doesn't understand what the expectations are. We've taken them they've been living in a refugee camp, and now they're expected to go into an elementary school and understand what the expectations of an American elementary school are. And they have no idea what they're supposed to do. They just don't know. And suddenly someone is sending them, to a therapist or to a day school because they're like, oh, they don't, there's something wrong. It's not that there's something wrong, it's that they don't know what's being asked of them. So it's also being careful not to pathologize things that are not a pathological behavior. In terms of trauma-informed care, that's when an organization says, we are going to be aware of how trauma affects a person, and that we are going to make every effort across the agency to be understanding of what triggers a trauma survivor and how we can be careful in how we provide services and be thoughtful in making sure that our approaches don't make trauma worse, and that we're supportive and we're not re-traumatizing people. How do we make services accessible and helpful to people? We also want to provide services that are evidence-based, in the sense that we're not just saying we're helping people. We actually know that what we're doing is helpful to people who have experienced trauma, that it's not just, something that we're like, well, we think this works. We can look at research and say the research says that this is useful to people who've experienced trauma in the past.
Are there barriers to helping some of these immigrant children to receive mental health care? And what are some of the barriers?
There's lots of them, unfortunately. Some of them have been mentioned. Translation can be a huge barrier. You know, one of the biggest things a lot of times is what happens is the child ends up being expected to translate, and it's wildly inappropriate to have a child translating for the parent or for other people. You should have a translator. The translator should be something, and this is what Michelle referred to earlier, who understands the language that you're using. There's a lot of very specific language in mental health. The person who's translating needs to understand the type of language that you're going to be using so that they're translating for the parent. A lot of times I found in having translators that the parent understands a lot more than they think that they're going to understand, but it's for the parent's comfort level. And it's for your comfort level as well, so that you understand that they are getting everything that they need to get and that you're getting everything that you need to get. That having that translator there is a comfort for both sides. It also allows you to then not have the child in the room when you're having a conversation that the child doesn't need to be present for. Another barrier a lot of times is the availability of times for services. You know, for certain families, they're working 2 and 3 jobs. So when can they come and when can they bring their child to services? Having someone who is available, telehealth has been huge, I know, for people, because they don't have to do as much driving around, picking their kid up, bringing them to a service, taking them back. That has made a big difference for people. But transportation can be an issue if it's a type of service where you're like, no, I really need the child in my office. Transportation can be a major barrier for people. And then just the available resources. Do people have the resources to be able to afford to pay for what their child needs? Do they know what's available in the community and how many resources are really available? Texas isn't great at providing services for children. We don't always have as many options as we would be great if we did. I think Austin has more than a lot of places. And so the more that we can provide services for children, the more that we can be aware that there's a population of kids who really are underserved, the more that, you know, we can offer for this population of kids.
Does immigration status have a bearing on these families' ability to get mental health services?
I think it definitely does. It matters whether or not they can feel trusting. I mean, I think Michelle touched on that earlier as well, with, do they feel like you're going to ask that? Do they feel that you are going to in some way report that to somewhere? How do they feel about your level, their level of trusting you as a provider? Because it matters, you know, that they have to feel safe in order to, you know, seek out a service for their child or for them or for their family.
So there's a question in the chat from Dee, who's asking, with many immigrant children being separated from their loved ones, often they are placed with unfamiliar caregivers temporarily. Is there resources for the caregivers to help them transition the children into their home? And are the siblings allowed to stay together? Is being asked by someone else. Who would like to answer? Any panelists can jump in there. Oh, don't be shy.
As far as I am aware, there are no resources for temporary caregivers or extended family members. And what gets tricky also is that those family members may be undocumented themselves. And so they may be afraid to ask for resources because, you know, the threat of their own preservation it becomes very present. But I am not aware of any government services or city services for these temporary caregivers to support children.
And we know that the foster care system is overwhelmed already. So even within, you know, documented children that were born in Texas, if their children go into foster care, they're not guaranteed to be together either. So unfortunately, that's not available.
Are we aware of any community resources or kind of localized resources that perhaps people could tap into if there aren't any specific from state government or federal government any other kind of local resources that might be helpful to families who are temporarily caring for immigrant children?
I mean, there's things at different elementary schools. There's like clothes closets, there's transportation. A lot of families have to live, maybe they're affiliated with the church, so maybe different church members are helping them. And I know in Round Rock we have, it's called a FIT bus, families in transition. So if children have to live at if a family has to live at a hotel or with this family for a while or this family for a while, they will pick them up and bring them to school because they want to keep their school as consistent as possible. And there's a couple families at the school I work with, and they have moved, 25, 30 times in a few years, just based on who is willing to let them stay. But in terms of things like healthcare, I know that it gets really hard for families because they try to use our school nurse sometimes because they're fearful of going someplace else. Like what Laura was saying, who's going to ask a question? Is there going to be a box that I accidentally check and then someone's going to try to come to my house? So some children's diabetes, asthma is being addressed through the schools.
I know that in the past, Lone Star Circle of Care, that was the population that they served, was they focused on underserved populations, and they did not ask if people were undocumented. They didn't ask any information, and they would cover an entire lifespan. So they would see children all the way through adults, because I worked in a local school, and we couldn't see the kids if they weren't on CHIP or weren't on any kind of insurance yet. And we had a kiddo who couldn't be seen because she wasn't on CHIP, and she couldn't get back on CHIP because she hadn't been seen by a doctor. So it was this stupid, circular problem. And Lone Star would see her to get her back onto CHIP, and they would help the family get the children back onto CHIP as well. And they had people who spoke Spanish. So you could call and get someone who spoke Spanish to help you get an appointment, to help you get onto CHIP, and to they would, like I said, they would see the whole family. So I know that they were hugely helpful to the family, because the mom came back in and was like, I'm telling everyone in my neighborhood. So I think that they still do that, but I mean, it's like worth looking into.
One thing I was just also going to add, I was hesitating in the beginning because I don't know exactly what the rule is with undocumented persons, but there's the Home and Community-Based Services program, and there's a lot of federal funds that are being put into it, but it really depends on what the state has applied for. So I'm just putting into the chat what is specific to Texas, and hopefully Texas is applying for a waiver for more funds through Medicaid.
I guess I would be remiss if I didn't sort of throw in there that Austin Child Guidance Center certainly sees any family. We don't ask questions about immigration status, and we don't turn people away for their inability to pay. So if there's a family seeking some case management or mental health resources, certainly through our walk-in clinic or through our traditional services, we're certainly a resource around those kinds of issues, and certainly perhaps can refer you or direct people to other resources if we're not able to provide whatever the specific needs are. So
I would like to add that I think we all have the opportunity to do something about this. I think we often think, well, who can we refer them to, or what services are out there? But the reality is that we all have the power to support the community at large, and specific families in particular. And there are small ways that we can do that. I know we've talked about trauma-informed care as being very important, culturally grounding, understanding what the needs are. And in my experience working with families, sometimes immigration status, although it's very important, it's the last thing on their mind, because they have so many other issues. COVID could be one, but these are families that also have a child that maybe is struggling with substance use, or they're experiencing intimate partner violence, or, I mean, there are so many different things, employment exploitation, that really is at the top of their minds. And I think what it takes is for us to have a stance of an open stance of approaching people and understanding what they need. And I don't mean approaching as in knocking on their door, but really seeing and acknowledging the people we interact with, we work with, who live next to us, and being open to what they might need and letting them define that, what feels comfortable for them. But I just want to make sure that we don't just say this is for somebody else to do. It's really something that we all can do in a variety of ways.
Thank you, Carmen, for sharing that. I kind of want to circle us back to sort of the educational piece, or kind of how these children are being, their experience in schools. I know years ago, I did a lot of work at the International High School here in Austin, which is a school for a lot of immigrant children who come high school age, who come to the United States, and it's like a 2-year school, and then they get transferred to their local high schools. And there was a lot of anxiety that I would see in some of those kids who were getting ready to move into their local high school, where they didn't have the support of a community that was sort of geared around helping them to get used to American high school systems. So one of the questions is, what can be done to help these students feel more included and welcome in their classrooms? What kinds of things can we do? Because I know that especially, when the pandemic first hit, and there was a lot of finger pointing, there were incidents at various high schools where students of Middle Eastern descent were, experienced terrible discrimination and kind of taunting from other students, or students of Chinese heritage kind of, were really mistreated. So it gets a complicated, or maybe not as complicated, but it's a really controversial and fraught subject. So I guess I'm just wondering if we can kind of pick it apart and think through ways, or talk about things that can be done to support these kids in these schools. Any panelists, please. Sorry, these are open to anybody who'd like to jump in.
I was thinking about what Isha was talking about with the policy. And I think that in terms of funding, in Round Rock, they're doing a lot of equity work. So there's a group at every campus that's talking about equity, and they're talking about it in ways that are very uncomfortable for teachers who are set in their maybe, I don't know how to say it, more conservative ways of thinking. I guess I'm just going to come right, like racism stuff. It's really hard to deal with in a large public school system because there's a cross section of people in it. And when teachers are told to change things, teachers are notoriously bad at changing anything. We're very rigid in our thinking. We think that we have the right idea. And then when a person is confronted with the idea that they may be harboring racist ideas, and our school got a large grant, which included a lot of literature. And in my own classroom, one of my assistants is refusing to read some of the books that are promoting, Black people, African, Pacific Islander. It's very challenging. So it's hard to know, it's really hard to unlearn some of your old behaviors, especially within such a large system as public school, because it, like I was saying before, it's such a rigid feeling, like we do this, we've always done this, this is our schedule, this is how we react to things, this is who we're going to refer to things. So I can't even remember what the original question was. I'm sorry, I got
no, it was just sort of, well, I mean, I think you're sort of in a way, it's sort of how can we make classrooms more welcoming? And it sounds like there are considerable barriers.
I think there's a lot of barriers, and the educators sometimes are the barriers, unfortunately. And it's hard to watch that, being in meetings where people are fighting for their positions to disrespect their students. It's hard to be a part of that system sometimes.
Also, I've noticed, because I've worked with teachers in Arizona, and I find some educators to be very aware of what their students are going through in their families, and other teachers to take more of the philosophy of, I just want to treat all my students the same way. Like, I just want all of them to succeed academically. So even though they're not endorsing racist ideas, I think the philosophy of treating everybody the same way is a missed opportunity, because not all children have the same needs, and in fact, some are experiencing crises, and to turn the other way and not acknowledge their lived experience and to not do something to further support their students is a form of racism as well. And I think it's really disheartening when students come from a family that is going through a lot of turmoil and they hope that the school can be their respite, and they're not getting the support that they need.
I came from a residential treatment facility fairly recently working there, and we had a kids council. And one of the things we talked to the kids about was what were the things that they felt were going well and what were the things they were struggling with. And some of it was sort of what we're talking about right now, like how they were feeling spoken to by adults and some of the things that were happening. And we talked about having basically difficult conversations, like how do we have difficult conversations? And kids who wanted to helped plan having those discussions and paired up with an adult to run the discussion. And that was pretty powerful for them and then for the adults, because it was coming from the kid and the kid saying, here's the conversation I want to have. Here's the things that I feel, because one of the things we used to talk about quite a bit was, even just within our facility, which was trauma informed, and we were, working with all of these kids who had issues and people were very aware of it. I would say to them, if a kid spoke to you the way you spoke to them, you wouldn't tolerate it. Or if another adult talked to you the way you talk to the kids, sometimes you wouldn't tolerate it. And they would say, but they need to learn, they need to hear, this is, I'm the adult, I'm in charge. I'm like, I get it, but no, you're not, you don't hear how you're talking to them. And hearing it from a kid during a time when a kid was calm and a kid could say, okay, I'm going to be in charge of this group, was pretty powerful for them. And I think that was helpful. There were still some adults who I think sat there like, okay, I'm going to let you say this, but I don't care. It was hard for them to hear. They didn't want to hear it. They did not. I think it was going to take a whole lot of conversation before that message was going to get through. But there were some people who went into the discussion that were like, I don't know why we're here. I don't know why we're doing this. This is uncomfortable. And left the discussion like, I'm so glad we had that discussion. I'm so glad we did that. I didn't think it was going to be good. I wasn't ready for it, but I'm glad that we did it. So I think that there were ways that it was more powerful than I think people expected it to be. It's also a pretty big lift for the kid. But I think for a lot of the kids, it felt very empowering because they felt like, here I am, I'm in residential treatment. I'm the kid who they always say, oh, you can't do this, you won't be able to do it. And they felt very, very empowered by the fact that a whole room full of adults who normally were telling them what to do, listened to them and really heard them in a way that I think they normally didn't feel that they always were listened to.
So on that note, I mean, it seems to me that sort of could be one strategy that some students, or excuse me, some institutions could use, maybe inviting more conversations where the kids have an opportunity to really speak up and share what their experiences are in school. But again, I think things like language barriers and other challenges where they're, as a result of a language, many kids come to school. And I know, just having worked with refugees myself, that Many of these kids come to the school, especially older kids, and they have very limited understanding of the English language. Sometimes when they come to this country and they're little, they can pick up the language more quickly. But if you're coming to the US and you're 14 or you're 15, it's much more difficult to pick up the language, but they still have to go to school. And a child that's experiencing some of this, but does not have the language capacity to communicate to those that could understand them in a school setting. What are some things that we could do to address some of these concerns? I mean, I know in Texas anyway, often Spanish is available, but if the child speaks, a different language, if they speak Arabic, if they speak Farsi, if they, what are some things that we can do as educators, as institutions to support them better in school settings? Thoughts?
I still think it has to involve listening to them. I still think we have to. One of the things I found working with our kids a lot of times when they're having like big emotional meltdowns or they're having issues is saying, what do you need? As opposed to what's wrong, what do you need? Because a lot of times they can tell you that something that would be helpful for them. Like this would be helpful for me. I need you to listen. I need you to walk away. I need you to, do X, Y, or Z. They can give you something. And I think people underestimate their ability to tell you that they can get something that would be helpful for them. So I do think that we don't give them enough opportunity to say what would be helpful, as opposed to us trying to impose things that we think would be helpful. And I think that is something that would be beneficial, is to do more listening and less talking in terms of what do you want? What would be something that they would want from us, as opposed to us telling them we think this would be helpful to you.
I think someone in the chat said something about working with parent educators. And I think that that's a way that we think of it a lot in elementary school, is that like the kids are not just these little people that come to us, they're a part of a family. And so we have a parent educator on our campus, and she does do things, teaching families like English, connecting them with services that are available to them. But also, I can't remember who said it, was talking about like how inflexible the time is for things. Like if families are working, it's very hard for them to come to a parent conference. So the virtual conferences have been extremely helpful, because really, in elementary, a lot of times kids are not as involved in the conversation about what they need, and especially in preschool. Preschoolers cannot do that. So for me, it's really talking with the families and trying to find out if there's things that we can do. But then it turns out there's older kids, there's a 5th grader, there's a middle schooler, there's a high schooler, and there's things that we can help them with. But there's that whole fear in the back of their minds that like, to the parents, if I ask for things, if I admit that I don't have what I need, maybe I'm going to get in trouble. So I think that's always in the back of their minds.
Well, and what other parts of the system are there that could be helpful? I know our postdoc came in this week and just was talking about that she met with other people in the Austin area who are part of the Muslim community. And they were talking about how the mosque could be helpful. So are there other parts of the community that could be, like you said, the kids don't live in a vacuum. They live in a system, either the family or a community or a church, or who else could be helpful that could be supportive of the family if the family can't be there because of various barriers. Is there somebody else that can be supportive and could be helpful? How do we loop those people in?
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. I was also an immigrant kid growing up in schools that that did not support my culture or identity, and I had to look outside of school in order to feel supported. And I look to community, and I think that can't be stressed enough how important that is. And I think in terms of where we think about, and at class, we also try to think about after school opportunities or community center opportunities, and also peers, and the value of peers and people who speak your language and who understand your culture, that can't be stressed enough.
There's a question in the chat. How much training is required for teachers? Educators should have more training available to help them learn how to work with immigrant children. I'll kind of direct this to you, Michelle. I don't know how much training teachers get around this. I would imagine that it's probably inconsistent and perhaps not enough.
I think that newer teachers, it's a lot more probably in their undergraduate programs than it was when I went to school in the early 90s. There was not a huge, it was not emphasized to my recollection. When I went to graduate school in the 2000s, it was much more emphasized. Because again, I was working in a school district that had a really large Asian influx. And so there were something like 57 languages spoken. So there was a lot of discussion around that. But in terms of, there's a lot of professional development that teachers have to do every year. Some of it is silly, some of it doesn't apply to what we're actually teaching. And then some of it is effective and helpful. But again, it's like they squeeze in these moments for us sometimes. You know, they're like, okay, today is parent conference day, but you also have to do a 6-hour training. So it's like you're trying to learn these skills that you really are interested in, but then you're also like, well, I have to step out of this meeting for 30 minutes so I can go quick talk to this mom. So the system of school is set up like your kids are at school for 7 hours a day at 7:30 to 3:30, and getting in that effective time to train teachers is a challenge. And the buy-in is very difficult for some people. It's not, because it's not a part of our evaluation system. Like I have never heard anybody say the way that I talked to my student was pointed out to me. Because like what Laura was saying, the way that you hear some teachers talk to in the hallway, full groups of students, the way that they will speak to them is shocking. And I can't believe it. But I've never heard anybody say, oh, and then in my evaluation, they pointed out these 75 times that I said horrible, demeaning things to my students, because it's like, it's this very strange environment where you talk about one thing, you talk about academics in general. And when you don't talk about academics, it's like, okay, what curriculum are we using to teach pro-social behavior? And I think that it's a work in progress. I think that schools are headed in the right direction. But there's a long way to go.
The other piece of advice that I would give to teachers is that it's impossible for us to say we need an X number of hours and we're going to be fully trained and completely competent, right? Like learning is a lifelong process, and we don't all have the same skills, the same knowledge, or access to the same knowledge. So when you feel like you have gaps in knowledge, or you have gaps in knowing how to interact with a student, identify somebody who does, and use that person as your mentor, as your supervisor, or your consultant, so that if you feel discouraged by the fact that the schools don't offer enough training, identify people who do feel already more confident in that area and go to them for advice.
I was just going to say, speaking or listening to what you were saying, Michelle, is that it seems like overtly the schools are saying we want to make space for these trainings. We want to make sure that our teachers are educated, but it sounds like the subtext, given that they're kind of squeezing some of these in between teacher conference days and other things, is that it's like checking a box. Like, we want to say that we gave these trainings, but we're not necessarily going to set aside real time to make sure that, across the board, that teachers are given the time and space to not only receive the training, but process it, think about it, such that they can then integrate it and implement it in their work with kids. I mean, I'm asking, that sounded like a statement, I know, but I'm really asking if that's how
Well,
it
because federally, you have 187 school days, and then tacking on more days for teacher training, that's just money. And so again, there's the piece of how much the federal government pays their fair share of our salaries of our schools, what Texas contributes, and then the shortfalls. So everything comes down to money, even though we're not a for-profit industry. It's really that's, I think, one of the worst things about being an adult is knowing all the truths about things. Like when I was young and I was first teaching, I'm like, this is great. I'm going to help these little kids and it's going to be wonderful. And then you find out like all these big picture things. And that's why I don't think I could ever be an administrator, because I don't want to know so much. It's so hard to know what it comes down to sometimes and how they aren't really trying. I mean, I know that the administrators on my campus are trying very hard to make space for us and to give us opportunities to talk about things while also doing the everyday minutia that they have to deal with that just seems so, just would wear you down. But that's why the teachers, it's like we try really hard within our teams to like what Carmen was saying, to seek out people that are going to help us, like the areas that we need attention in. And there are a lot of ways that we can do that. But again, it's like what people don't know, they don't know. So that's what's really hard right now. That's what's hard, I think, in schools and for younger teachers, or for teachers that they don't understand what they're doing to their students. Because again, like maybe they've been doing this for many years and they think this is the way we do things. So this is the way I'm going to continue to do them. And we have to work. We have to get through the day kind of mentality.
There's a question in the chat. In your work, I'm not sure who it's directed to, have you experienced barriers to providing mental health services to children and adolescents due to lack of buy-in from a parent or family member related to their cultural belief system? For example, some individuals might not believe there is a need, or they think these behaviors or needs will go away. Maybe I'll direct this to you, Laura.
Yes. And sometimes it's because they see the behavior as willful. Like they'll just say, well, this is you. And a lot of times I see it with either behavior that's trauma-based or that's like ADHD. For whatever reason, ADHD seems to be something that people will say a lot of times, well, they could control it if they wanted to. And a lot of times that's because kids with ADHD can focus on something that they find really, really fascinating, like video games. And parents will say, well, if they want to, they can do it. And I'm like, that's not how that works. But you also see where sometimes culturally, that's not something that it's not a norm for them, or it's not something that they experienced in their own lives. You know, I've had parents that said, you know, yeah, no, that happened to me when I was a kid and you just deal with it, you know, so they don't, to them, the idea that you would have treatment for something that is to them a pretty normative experience, you know, they don't see it as a value. And sometimes they don't have, a lot of times the kids that I worked with in the one school that I was in, where the families were predominantly immigrant families, the kids were they were what we would consider parentified. So they were dealing with helping translate for, you know, dealing with bills. I had kids who were like 14 and were driving, and were helping. They would come home from school, and the one family cleaned office buildings at night. And I had a 5th grader that was cleaning office buildings at night because they needed the money. And so mental health was not a huge focus because it was, we need the money to live. So, and I don't think it was because people didn't want to support their children. It was, being sad wasn't the biggest, highest, and most important thing at that point. They were like, we need to be able to pay our bills and pay our rent and be able to live.
Well, mental health services are always sort of kind of secondary to higher level needs like food, shelter, and things like that. So it's a tough sell. Mm-hmm. Family does not have those basic needs met. Were there things that you were able to communicate to the parents to help them to set aside their own personal values or beliefs about whatever their child was going through so that the child could access services?
I did with the little boy whose family had, where he was working at night, we did services in the school, and his parents were very, understand. They were like, oh, okay. He was very bright. He was a super, super smart kid. And they were very focused on his education and they wanted him to do well. And so I think they didn't quite understand why he felt the way he felt, but they didn't not want him to have help. I think it didn't quite make sense to them what was happening that was making him feel sad. But they weren't against it. I had another family that I worked with through ACGC where we had a child who had some psychotic symptoms, and that was really, really difficult. That one was a harder lift for the family to acknowledge, in terms of that he had some pretty serious mental illness, and it was really that was difficult for them.
Go ahead, Carmen.
I also wanted to add, in my experience working with families, is that families grow up with a code of secrecy. And what that means is that, it's not safe for children to talk about their parents being undocumented, for example. It's not safe for children to talk about their struggles, or for children to get in trouble like a normal child could get in trouble, because it could have serious repercussions on the family. And so what I see a lot of is this culture of not talking about things because it could be dangerous to talk about things. And so I think as therapists, we need to understand that, and we need to not, in some ways, what parents have had to do when I've worked with their adolescents is they've had to give their adolescent permission to talk, because otherwise it seems like something that could be really scary for adolescents. And the other piece is that parents sometimes don't know what to say, and they're afraid that by talking to their children, that it's going to traumatize them even more, that it's gonna, that they won't be able to support them emotionally in the way that the child will need it. And so that's why they don't talk to their children about it. So I think we, as therapists, we also need to respect that. We need to honor that resistance and say, what are some things that your child might want to know from you that you would feel comfortable sharing? And so, in essence, aligning what children need with what parents can give. And often parents resort to saying everything's going to be okay. They provide this sense of reassurance, but that is not always helpful to the child, because the child knows that no, everything is not going to be okay, right? So what can you provide? What real reassurance can you provide? Even if that's very limited, but saying, I don't know, I cannot guarantee that I can protect you or protect the family, but I will always talk to you about what is going on. That's one thing that parents could do in that situation.
Thank you, Carmen. That's very useful. There's a question in the chat. I'm not clinically trained, but what tools would be most beneficial to provide support to these children? I think what you just said, Carmen, from a parental perspective is certainly one thing, but there are other tools that any of the other panelists might want to share that could be helpful to this person. I see lips moving, but our mute buttons are on.
I think someone in the chat actually makes a really good point about pointing people towards resources, and saying, because sometimes I think people get focused on, and I think this sort of goes back to what Carmen said, not focusing on trying to get them to focus on, nurturing and those kinds of things. What can they actually provide? Like, what is the parent able to give? And if it is easier for them to focus on what resources can we help them with? What are they able to give, as opposed to trying to make them into something that they're not? Because I think that can be easier, because sometimes what you run into is sort of what Carmen talked about at the very beginning, where you've got a child who's more Americanized versus a parent who is much more traditional. And you're getting like a culture clash in between the two, the parent and the child. And trying to navigate that is really difficult. And it's not really, that's not what you're there for. I don't ever feel like it's my job to try to figure out, who's right so much. There's not a right or a wrong there. For me, it's more of about, how do I help them get through this period right now? How do I help this child get to a place of feeling more confident, or feeling less anxious, or feeling safer, and help the parent get their child to that place, so that everybody is feeling in a better position. Because you do end up with a period a lot of times where you have a parent who's saying, this is not our value system. This child wants to do such and such, and that's not what the parent believes in. But if you can help them get to a place of feeling that the child is safer or has better coping skills, and even then it just gets them to a place where they're at least communicating better.
Someone in the chat is asking if we could have a discussion on the white savior complex applied to this population. And we absolutely can have that discussion. And I guess I'm wondering, obviously in a very homogenized society or system, like a school system, or certain communities where immigrants and refugees are kind of displaced or placed into these areas where, often they've never been in a place where they are, the difference between who they are and their culture and what they look like is so stark. And then there are certainly plenty of well-meaning people who are kind of rushing in to try to support them, but definitely that kind of savior complex can be an issue. So what are some thoughts or suggestions or comments that any panelists would like to make on this subject?
I don't know if this directly addresses that question, but it's related to the last question too. And I can see some connections between both, is to talk about what is happening with young people and kids as in terms of an asset-based approach, rather than thinking about what Laura was saying in the beginning about pathologizing. I think and I think it addresses the white savior complex question and trying to say, oh, something is wrong with you. Oh, you have gone through all of these things, and I'm here to save you. Rather reframe it to really focus on a child's or a young person's, like, what do they bring to the table, and what think about all of the aspects of their lives that really make them the person that they are, and bringing and really thinking about a wellness in terms of wellness. In all of our policy work on our team, we really try to bring young people to the table and listen to young people and what they have to say. And no one says that they want to think of things from, oh, something's wrong with me. They really want to be focused on wellness and strengths. So I think that is kind of answering the white savior complex question, but I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, and I don't know if we're also moving on to the last question, but the last question is about how can mental health therapists foster an environment where parents can feel safe disclosing their immigration status so they can get access to resources. And my perspective on that is that I think we need to honor where parents are, even if that means that they don't feel comfortable disclosing that to you, because there could be real repercussions to the family. And if the family doesn't want to talk about it, I wouldn't try to create a space where they can, because I think they need to do what they feel is right for their family. Now, I would say that as a mental health provider, you can offer resources without knowing whether the family actually needs it or not. And so, you really don't need to know from the family. You don't need confirmation from the family that they're undocumented to know what services or resources they need and to offer those to the family. So I would really discourage you from making that a goal in services.
Well, and Carmen, what you said made me think of something when one of the first trauma-based classes that I took, somebody in the audience said, well, how do we know what their trauma was? And that, I think, is a very, maybe an American perspective or like an educator's perspective. Is like, we want to know the why, but we don't need to know the why. If we see the behaviors, if we see them hoarding food, hiding, the fearfulness, all these things, then we can make an assumption that they need our assistance with their mental health, with their traumatic experience, because maybe their traumatic experience was that their mom yelled at them in the car. That doesn't mean they're not experiencing, you know what I mean? Like, we can still address it. And so what you said really resonated with me, that we can offer resources without knowing the why. We don't need to know the why, because again, that's not always our business. For me, it's not my business always.
Yeah. And their status isn't going to make a difference in terms of what service you provide to them in terms of the child's mental health or the family's status, like in terms of family therapy or things like that. It's not going to change how you interact with the family. And like you said, you can offer whatever, but you don't need to say to them, oh, what's your status, or, any of those things. Because all it does is it adds a layer of stress for the family of, oh, now, you're asking me something. Why do you want to know? And you run the risk of them disappearing and you're not going to see them again. And to me, that puts an added level of stress on the family. And then the added level of, now you have a kid who may not get services at all, or it may be another 6 months before they feel safe enough to try someone else, or they just may not try again.
Alberto in the chat just stated, working in a court, I try to find a way to ask because it could prevent them from obtaining legal status in the future. I also work with a nonprofit to help families apply for legal status. I think that speaks to the difference between legal entities and mental health kind of entities. So that in a legal context or in a court type context, it might be prudent to know their status. In a mental health context, though, to the point that was already made, it's less important in those instances for us to have the why, because we can provide resources and services regardless of the details often. But that, that sounds like it is perhaps not the case in the legal setting. One thing I wanted to throw out before as I know we're getting close to the end, but one thing we haven't touched on that I want to kind of just make space for is, in school settings, how can we encourage the dominant population? So American students, the typical student, to be more understanding and supportive of these immigrant children who are also in the same setting. What are things that we as educators and mental health providers can do to encourage and support the average American kid who's in school with these immigrant populations to sort of be more supportive, empathic, and understanding of these students who are really trying to find their way in American institutions?
I think there's always the risk of tourist curriculum, which is like Chinese people eat rice, Mexican people like tortillas, because a lot of things in education get boiled down like that because teachers are trying to teach about a culture in a day or in a month. We have African American month, these different situations. So a different way of kind of looking at it is like literature, having appropriate literature for kids to just see themselves in everyday life. They don't have to be like marching, or they don't have to be doing social justice things. They could just be walking to the park with their dad in the book, but they're Black or they're Asian or something like that. I think in elementary school, we have to look at how children are being represented. And then also, I don't know, there's a lot of, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The tourist curriculum thing, though, I think is very offensive. And it's a thing that a lot of people can point to when you see some of the art projects that come home from school, like at Thanksgiving, they make Indian headdresses. And it's really hard to move away from that for some people, and to make it more like inviting the families in to talk about their culture if they so choose. And then it's not like, this is what all Mexican people do. This is what all people from El Salvador do. Like, this is what my family does. Because then it's more personalized. I think that that's been effective. And then obviously in pre-COVID times, we could have families come in and do that. And so I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get back to being able to invite people to come into the classroom more and having different educational experiences like that for them.
And also, I would say, just like we racially socialize people of color, I think white children should be racially socialized so that they are aware of their background and the privilege that comes with their background and how that influences the way they interact with others, the way that policies disproportionately affect others. And because, I mean, we do a disservice to white children by not socializing them to their own race.
I think that's a great point. So I do have one kind of last question for the panelists, but before I do that, I just want to wrap up because I'm aware that we now have 7 minutes left. So I just want to make a couple of comments. First, I want to thank everybody that registered for joining us tonight. And I certainly want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists, Michelle, Carmen, Laura, Isha. I so appreciate you guys joining us. There's lots of other things you could have been doing with your Tuesday night. Certainly, if you know of or have a child that may benefit from talking with one of our therapists at ACGC, please give us a call or direct them to our walk-in clinic. It's on Tuesdays at 3:30. You can just walk in. You don't need an appointment, and you can be seen by an English or Spanish speaking clinician. For those of you that contributed to tonight's event, you're supporting children and families who would otherwise not be able to access mental health care, so thank you. Many of those families, incidentally, are immigrant families, or children from other marginalized communities. So we offer these panel discussions monthly-ish. We're not going to have one in November or December because of the holidays, so the next one will be in January. But please kind of be on the lookout for other topics at the beginning of the year. And as I mentioned earlier, the video and a list of resources will be up on our website sometime next week. So the last question is sort of a flash round. And I guess I would just like to ask each panelist, to give us a short answer in terms of, for participants, if there's one thing that the participants take away from this discussion tonight, what's the most important thing that you think that folks should be taking away from what we talked about tonight? And we'll just start, if we could, with Isha. We can go in order.
Sure. So I loved what Carmen said towards the beginning of this panel, saying that, we all need to play our part in not passing the buck to somebody else. And we need to play our part in contributing to this and raising awareness, and also trying to figure out how we can provide support ourselves. So thank you, Carmen, and thanks for allowing me to be on this panel.
Happy to have you. Laura?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think just in general in working with kids, being able to identify kids' behavior is a language. They're telling you something. So when you see behavior that sometimes feels like, oh, they're just acting out, can you look at it through another lens of what are they trying to tell me? You know, are they just having a bad day? Because sometimes kids are having a bad day. Or is this an ongoing issue? And what does that mean? You know, is there something else going on that I need to be paying attention to?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle?
To piggyback on Laura, that's what we say in early childhood all the time, is that every behavior is communication. So even children who can't speak the language, who are pre-verbal, who are not using language yet, they're still communicating with us. And so the helpful adults in their environment, the ones who are paying attention, are going to be the ones who are going to be able to help them the most.
Thank you, Michelle. Carmen?
My takeaway is that we've been talking a lot, and rightfully so, on the signs of distress in these children. But there are also a lot of signs of resilience and resistance in these children and families. And there's also a great deal of cultural wealth that these families have at their disposal. And so whether we're working with them in a legal setting or in a therapeutic setting or educational setting, is to really keep that in mind, that that these children are not full of problems or at risk necessarily, or in a predetermined path of struggle, but that there's a great deal of joy and belonging, that they also just want to be treated as normal children. And so that's the message that I think we should keep in mind.
I really appreciate you pointing that out. They are normal children, right? They absolutely are normal children. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, and that's a perfect way to end. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much to our panelists. We're actually going to be able to end 2 minutes early. That might be a first. I really appreciate everybody joining us. Again, you could have been doing a lot of other things with your Tuesday night. Thank you for hanging in there with us. And we hopefully will look forward to seeing some of you guys back in January. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening.